Hello, my name is Dashel, and I am going to be presenting about how music and other art forms have this very powerful ability to influence change in a way that a lot of other mediums that we would expect to do so don't necessarily have quite the same ability, as well as how, like, the cross-pollination of different races and cultures and their art styles, how that lends to greater ingenuity and innovation. So Marvin Gaye is a great example of the way in which music and other art forms can lead to great cultural and political change in a way that politicians and journalists often can't. He's also a really good example of how bilateral cross-pollination between white and black aesthetic traditions benefits artists and the American cultures at large. So Marvin is really interested in making some socially conscious music for a fair amount of time, maybe like 3 or 4 years before he makes What's Going On. But he didn't really have the opportunity because he's with Motown, and their approach at the moment is just kind of making saccharine pop stuff, like very, kind of simple, sweet soul pop. So he doesn't really have a platform, and he's going through a lot at this time. His duet partner, the person that he did Ain't No Mountain High Enough with, Tammy Terrell, had just died of a brain tumor. His brother had just gotten home from the Vietnam War and has told him a lot of terrible stories about what he saw, and his marriage with Anna Gordy, who's the sister of Berry Gordy, is falling apart. He has a cocaine habit that's kind of on the fence of really messing him up and becoming a major issue. So he has a lot going on. And anyway, a songwriter by the name of Ronaldo Benson recently witnessed a police beating, basically like some cops attacking some hippies in the San Francisco area for no reason, and he sees that from a distance and asks himself what's going on. Kind of ends up writing a little bit of a song idea for that. He goes to the Four Tops with it, and they reject it because it's too political. So then he goes to Marvin with it, and Marvin likes it a lot, and he kind of tweaks it, edits it, rearranges it, and makes a demo out of it. The biggest change he makes to it is that he takes the question mark out of the title and makes it a statement, this is what's going on, as opposed to asking what's going on. He makes a demo, and he sends it over to Berry Gordy, who's on vacation in Barbados or something. And Berry Gordy says, quote unquote, it's the worst thing he's ever heard. That's rather ironic because it turns out to be one of the most commercially successful pieces of work ever. But yeah, so he says he does not like the Dizzy Gillespie style of scatting, in the bridge, and he just thinks it's overall too jazzy and political in tone. And Marvin refuses to record any other music and kind of starts a little bit of a stalemate. In the meantime, the Motown vice president of distribution and sales, Barney Ailes, gives permission without Berry Gordy's approval for 100,000 units of the single to be pressed. There's a final version at this point, not just a demo. It sells out within 24 hours of its release, 100,000 copies, and then another 100,000 copies are printed days later and sold out within the week, making it Motown's fastest record sales ever from that point on even. So Gordy is, of course, very pleased with what's going on from a monetary standpoint, very successful. So he goes over to Marvin's house. This is, of course, after he finds out that it's been released, which, he probably wasn't happy about at first, but then realizes how well it did. So he goes over to Marvin's house and asks Marvin to make a full record because of how well it's doing. And Marvin kind of reluctantly obliges. And Wiley Gordy makes a bet with Marvin that he won't be able to make a full album and submit it within a month, and he of course does. He produces the entire thing himself, and in the album he kind of expands on the issues that he's talking about in the single, What's Going On. So the nature of ecology and drug abuse, injustices, suffering. So What's Going On, the album, is interrelated issues: Vietnam War, police brutality, political turmoil, environmental challenges, mercy me. All of these problems intertwined, and Marvin kind of reframes the conversation as being a conversation and being about spreading love versus debate, this two-sided discourse that's war is right, stop the communists, versus war is evil, people are getting killed. Marvin kind of takes a non-political stance and tries to show that people have a lot in common and that everybody's in this together. And he kind of then proceeds to do a similar thing, reframing sexuality with his next big song, like 2 years later, Let's Get It On. Instead of typical salacious sex puns and, things that reinforce that sexuality is an illicit behavior, he reframes it as healthy behavior, and then another couple years later, he takes it even further with Sexual Healing, describing human sexuality as being a healing agent in a positive, almost clinical way, and does it in a musically compelling enough way that everyone kind of accepts the lyrics. That being said, if he were to have done that in writing, like a poem or something, nobody would have taken it seriously. So that gets back to my point of like how music, or what's going on, and Sexual Healing and Let's Get It On, these are all examples of music kind of providing a more palatable way to having a conversation about things that like aren't was easily addressed. So big picture wise, music can really push boundaries and alter long-lasting ways of thinking in ways that other communication channels, like I just said, like politics itself, prose, journalism, don't really have the ability to influence as prominently, because like softer pop culture forms can change people more because they fly under the radar in a sense, unlike seem less important and therefore can have more of an impact at the end of the day because of their more subtle nature. So at this time, like in the 70s, environmental crisis is something that's mostly only really talked about by like young, wealthy white people, upper middle class white people, because it's considered a fringe point of view at this point in time. And Marvin kind of sheds light on it with, like Mercy, Mercy Me, a pop anthem. He's discussing environmental and ecology issues, and he makes it like emotionally resonant. It's like a feeling in everybody's gut that it's like a major problem that needs to be addressed. And from there, it slowly but surely becomes a regular conversation that most reasonable people are willing to have. But within like the next 2 decades, like by the 90s, that's become a pretty normal thing. And at this point, it's of course like, 98% of scientists agree upon it. It had a long way to go. So, decades later, around that time, maybe 10 years after that, 2007, John Mayer puts out Waiting on the World to Change, which uses really similar sensibilities to what Marvin did with What's Going On. It's like even pretty similar in like rhythm and melody structure. Of course, the message is similar, and then he does the kind of jazzy bridge thing, which definitely seems like direct homage to Marvin in some way, but that's a cool way that Marvin kind of allowed that to happen. And I think another thing that Marvin kind of had a legacy for in that sense is like rap music being able to kind of call things out directly or whatever. Like, this is like a side note, but I definitely feel like NWA probably might not have had the courage to make a record as directly calling out what they see or whatever as like fuck the police. So I think in general that definitely set an important tone doing that in the 70s and making that a normal thing to make pop music that's calling out social injustices. But anyway, so What's Going On and Waiting on the World to Change, they're both kind of similar in tone, both kind of sad and wistful, like an elegy, kind of nostalgic about the past, things not going right, but hopeful for the future, as opposed to kind of like an aggressive, dismissive tone or something. And what I mean by that is that it just seems like songs like that have a better chance at actually getting through to people. So I think there's a reason why like those important kind of social anthems or whatever they tend to have that kind of tone, because I think that has an easier time of actually retaining a listener. And then Hard Rain Is Going to Fall by Bob Dylan is another similar example where it's like a rainy English folk song kind of vibe, and Dylan in the 60s kind of lays the groundwork for political and social storytelling to be part of pop music, because I never really had before that. And he kind of combines, folk music's naturalism with soul and blues influences. And then one of Jimi Hendrix's most iconic performances was, All Along the Watchtower, which is a song by Bob Dylan. And Hendrix kind of perfects that song in his own right with his, iconic performance, and sort of essentially like retires that song because like his version is like becomes like more important in some sense. And I think it's kind of cool how that era like has a very like complex cross-pollination of blues and soul, rock, country styles, kind of intermixing black and white takes. And it's a very like complex handoff between different musical styles and cultures, because like at the end of the day, Bob Dylan appeared to sort of just want to be like a black blues artist, and a lot of black artists kind of wanted to be like Bob Dylan. So people argue like, is it appropriation, is it stealing? And it seems like on balance that when people combine different cultural traditions and the outcome is innovation, that like there's an impact that might not have happened without that interaction. So I think at the end of the day, it's like, yes, there are a lot of circumstances where there is appropriation and there is, something that we talk about in class a lot, where there's a very consistent, repetitive thing where black artists are kind of fucked over by the labels. Like, they're in like a desperate position money-wise, and the labels exploit their talent and hard work to give them an advance or whatever, so that they can like handle their finances for like a week, and then like long term it's a terrible disaster. So that's one like absolute downside. But I think a kind of cool thing that's come from the cross-pollination and like intermixing the way that the art has like progressed in itself. So I just mean to say that there is kind of a balance, I think, between good and bad.